What if the smallest changes in your daily routine could ignite a profound transformation in your life? Well, today we're going to be talking to someone really interesting. We're going to have this enlightening conversation with Dr. Jeff Karp. He's an esteemed MIT fellow and a renowned bioengineer. And we're going to explore his latest book, Lit, which is Life Ignition Tools. And we're going to talk about how Dr. Karp and his lab, they harness nature's wisdom to create these really cool, innovative tools that are empowering individuals to unlock their full potential and actually create some really interesting medical grade inventions, as well as talking about some of his life-changing insights along the way. And all I know, folks, is you're going to want to listen because this episode 6 of the Spiritual Technologies podcast is going to be lit.
Welcome to the Spiritual Technologies Podcast with Travis Wright, where mindfulness intersects with the cutting edge of tech. Dive into conversations with leading experts that illuminate the path to a higher self, blending spiritual insights with technological advancements. Join us in this journey of discovery and transformation.
Welcome to the podcast for the conscious curious and the not so woo-woo, but maybe a little woo. Thank you so much to the 27,000 plus subscribers to our show already. We really appreciate you. I mean, seriously, thank you so much. So if you like, make sure to subscribe, like, and most importantly, click that bell so you get notified, because otherwise it will go into the great unknown and, YouTube won't show it to you. So make sure you do that. Also, I'm rocking the yellow today for the solar plexus chakra. Yellow is that color of the third chakra spectrum, and it is associated with personal power and self-esteem and willpower and personal identity, which seems fitting because our next guest is Dr. Jeff Karp. Welcome to Spiritual Technologies, good sir.
Hey, so great to meet you.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Lit is the book. I saw this. I think somebody had recommended it on Instagram, and I was like, whoa, Life Ignition Tools. This looks awesome. So I went and looked at it. I said, boom, I'm buying it. Started reading it. And I was like, dude, we got to interview this guy. So thanks for coming on.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
Beautiful, beautiful. So let's get right to the beginning there. So what inspired you to write Lit? And, maybe how did this concept sort of bubble up?
Sure. So maybe like 7 or 8 years ago, Heather Jackson, who's an agent in New York, reached out to me. She had read some articles on my work where we turned to nature for inspiration to solve medical problems. And we do that as a way to kind of infuse fresh energy into the lab, and also, to come up with ideas that we typically wouldn't think of. We've been using it in solving many different medical problems. And so she reached out and said, hey, how would you like to write a book on this? And I was immediately interested, but there was something kind of burning within that I was more passionate about writing at the time. And that really is how, when I was younger, I struggled with undiagnosed ADHD and learning differences. And I didn't know it. My parents didn't know it. My teachers certainly didn't know it. And I developed all kinds of tools and strategies along the way, initially for survival, but eventually to thrive. And I really wanted to write about those strategies and sort of share them with the world. And Heather was open to that. And so that's how Lit really began.
Nice. Yeah, that was an interesting read. And you're like, so some of the teachers thought, wow, this guy cannot pay attention. What is going on with him? And I think it goes to the point, Dr. Karp, where, I don't even know how many types of genius that there are. But I think the schooling system in many ways is sort of broken down because we want everybody to sit down and shut up and listen to us. And dude, we got all this energy. Like, how am I going to sit down and shut up and pay attention to you? I need to get up and run around. So how do you think that really sort of shaped your early career and your journey on this thing?
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, I think we're wired for experiential learning, to really be out in nature, to be sort of out doing something, active, our whole bodies, our minds, everything kind of being all in. And so being in a classroom, sitting in a chair and sort of listening to a single person speak, it's just not a normal thing. And I think that what happens is that, there's a certain percentage of kids who can follow along, but there's a huge number that really can't. And, everybody's on a spectrum.
Mhm.
Everybody has different ways of learning and processing information. And I was pretty extreme. So, what happened was in the second grade, I would sit at the back of the class, just, nothing was working. I didn't understand anything. I wasn't keeping up with anything. My mom tried flashcards and phonics, and nothing worked. And I wasn't connecting with anybody socially. So I kind of felt like an alien, really. And what happened was, at the end of the year, Mr. Steadwell, the teacher, second grade teacher, he pulled my parents aside and said, "I really like Jeff to repeat the second grade." And my parents negotiated so that if I spent the summer with tutors, that to try to catch up, that I could move on to the third grade. And so all my classmates went on vacation, and here I am in summer school. And I would go in, every day, and they'd read passages and do all sorts of things. And this one particular day, I remember because it was just so transformative for my life. And it really is where lit began, in between second and third grade. So what happened on this day is I went in, and the tutor read me a passage and asked me some questions. I gave answers. But then on this day, she asked me a different question that she had never asked me before. In fact, no one had ever asked me this question before, which is, how did you think about that? And that
Mm.
question all of a sudden sort of shifted my awareness, in a way to almost like this canvas appeared, this ability to think about thinking. I'd never thought about it. Here is this impulsive kid who just said what was ever on his mind, just acted very quickly. And in this moment, I realized, wait a moment here. I can actually think about what I say before I say it. It just kind of gave me a window into that. And I started to examine my thought patterns. And I almost felt like, kind of looking back, it was like I was in some ways like a kind of analogy with a computer. Like I had hardware, but I didn't have any software that was
Mhm.
working for me. And I needed to program, I needed to develop that software in an experiential way. And so what happened was I just started observing other people in the class. I started noticing how people said certain things in certain scenarios. And I started learning that way. I realized that the way that I learn is through asking questions. And whenever I asked a question, I was able to hyper focus for a few moments afterwards on the answer. I could never pay attention in class. In fact, in college, even, I stopped going to most of my classes. And so questions became a key for me to learn. And I just got better and better and better at asking questions, and would corner teachers and professors whenever I could, go in on weekends and after classes. And that's how one of the key strategies that I use to initially survive.
I love that. You know what I mean? I think that school, in a lot of ways, is sort of, it drills that curiosity out of you, right? And I think we're in a time where we need critical thinking and problem solving maybe more than ever before. And school doesn't, in my experience, doesn't tend to, teach that critical thinking skill. I remember when I was going to school, and I was one of the last generations of students to still get SWATs, right? I just turned 51. And so if I acted out in class or I was disrupting, then I was going out in the class and I'm getting a couple SWATs. And I got SWATs up until my junior year in high school.
Well, oh my gosh.
They were trying to beat the hilarity out of me, but I'm a little too rebellious. And I'm like, that's
Yeah.
not going to happen. But they want people, as we talked about, to sit down, shut up, and pay attention to us. And they like you to regurgitate facts, but not think about
Yeah.
necessarily those facts or how to even solve problems for yourself. And they don't tend to allow you to be collaborative in school.
Mhm.
When you get out into the real world, we're very collaborative. Like they teach you, don't fail, don't try. So it's like, don't experiment, don't test things, and don't work with people around you because you got to do it on your own. And that's the exact opposite of how the real world is, it seems to me, Dr. Karp.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, the education system's very kind of formulaic. It's very sort of very specific kind of algorithm,
Hmm.
where it's just all about giving answers. It's not about questioning, even, to your point about
Hmm.
experimentation. In fact, my mentor, during my postdoctoral fellowship at MIT, Bob Langer, who's a co-founder of Moderna, one of his quotes, is, he has many, is essentially, in school, we're basically, the emphasis is on answers, but in life, the emphasis is on questions. And
Mm.
so, it's one of these
Nice.
things, and it's even worse than how we're talking about it here, because I think we've all been shamed at some point in our life for asking the stupid question, by a parent or teacher, whoever it is. And then we hesitate to ask questions. And not only that, we also haven't been developing the skill. Like, asking questions is actually a skill that we can get better at, regardless of where you're at. You can improve your questioning ability. And in my laboratory, that's really the key, like, that's what separates the academics, or pretty much anyone in any job, from excelling and doing their best work, is asking high value questions.
Mm.
And so, one of the chapters in the book is actually, or one of the tools is called "Live for the Questions," because it's just so important. And there's so many examples, in my life, of where I thought I was good at asking questions, and then I realized that there was a whole new level, and it just keeps going and going and going.
Mm. Is there a resource that you'd maybe recommend for the art of asking better questions, even internally or even about your career? Like, what, I know that Lit has some really good thought processes around that, but maybe what are some resources that you used to get to the point where you started asking better questions?
Yeah, well, there's a number of stories, like sort of encounters, personal experiences, that really help me to ask questions. A friend of mine wrote a book, Hal Gregerson, from MIT Sloan School, the business school, on asking questions. So people can go and check that out. Really amazing book. And he actually interviewed me for his book, because we have a certain way of asking questions in my laboratory, and it's kind of come out of my personal experiences. But I'll give you one example of something that happened in my life, actually, when I got to graduate school, University of Toronto. And it's the first week there, and there's these invited speakers. So speakers come from all around the world, and they give a lecture, and then there's question and answer period at the end. And I'm sitting there, kind of dozing off during the talk. We get to the question and answer period, and it's like the arrows start flying. Like, the questions that people were asking were just cutting right to the heart of what the speaker had presented on. And I'm sitting there thinking, I'm pretty good at asking questions, but these questions aren't coming to me. Like, I was almost shaming myself. Why am I not thinking of these
Mm.
questions? Like, these are the most important questions. And so I used to play chess with my dad when I was younger. And I started thinking, what separates a novice or amateur chess player from an advanced chess player is pattern recognition. So an advanced player can, think ahead maybe 15, well, maybe not 15, but like 10, 11, 12 moves. Maybe some can get to 15, like Magnus Carlsen and, others like him. But so I started thinking, like, maybe there's a way I can bring pattern recognition to questioning. And so the next seminar that I went to, um, everyone was focused on what the speaker was saying, but I was focused on something completely different. I was focused on the questions that people were asking, and I actually wrote them all down.
Hmm.
And I went to the next lecture and I wrote them down, the next one, the next one, the next one. And then after, 2 or 3 months, I basically said, okay, I'm going to look at these questions. And, it took a few days. I'm like looking them over, kind of, thinking nothing's really coming to me. And then all of a sudden, light bulb moment, I realized that there were 4 or 5 categories that all the questions would fit under. One is, did they have the right controls? Did they, like, was the experiment actually working? Sometimes the experiment doesn't work and you get like crappy results. And so there's questions around, did they set up the experiment properly? And then there's some questions around the importance of the results. So if you're developing a diagnostic for blood, but you did all of your experiments in salt water, saline, then your results might look amazing, but you haven't yet done it in this complex blood system where it's much more challenging. And so the results aren't yet important. Or, there were questions also, a lot of times a speaker might overstate their conclusions. The data that they generated doesn't actually support what they're concluding. And so there were questions around that and questions around statistics and things. And so all of a sudden I had this insight into the motivation behind the questions that people were asking. And so the next seminar, I go in and I'm like hyper focused. I got my detective hat on. I'm taking notes. The questions that others are, I'm trying to poke holes, right, in what the speaker is saying. So it kind of made a very engaging, thing for me. And the questions that others had asked those questions are coming to me now. And not only that, I'm getting curious. Like I'm really into this. And then beyond that, I was tapping into my creativity because I started to think about, what I knew, what I was learning, and how that connected to what I knew, and new experiments or applications that the speaker could go after. Like I was coming up with ideas for the next experiments that they could perform. And so that sort of skill or that experience taught me that questioning is a skill regardless of where you're at. I mean, I'd been asking questions my whole life. Like at that point, it was a survival skill for me, but I realized that there's, the levels just keep going and going.
Yeah, you found a way to sort of hone your brain into an area, and you were on fire. You were truly lit. It seemed like that once you identified that pattern recognition. And as a conspiracy theorist who's been accurate about 90% of my theories since the year 2000, it's really, you're not conspiracy theorist. You're a pattern recognizer. You start seeing things. You go, wait a second. Start asking questions that maybe other people don't ask questions about to kind of reveal truths that maybe others don't necessarily see. So I love that. I think that you're right on. The ability to ask questions and find better ways to ask questions, not only for yourself personally, but for yourself professionally, I think is a profound skill that everyone can have. And that's why, having done this podcast, this is episode 6, but I've done well over 1,000 podcast interviews on other shows that I've done. And so always about those, listen to what they're saying. Oh, what about this? I like that, poking holes. What? Yeah. Wait a second. Where are you not correct? And maybe that's it. Maybe that's an ego thing too, right? We're going, wait a second. But I love that. I think that there's some fascinating insights there. Remaining curious. Don't let schooling beat curiosity out of you. You really have to unlearn that, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, the most watched TED Talk of all time is Ken Robinson's talk. And he basically, the whole premise of his talk is how the education system educates kids out of being curious and creative, right? And so I think that it's really up to us. We're at the switches to resensitize that, to regain that. It's ours to have, right? I mean, all of us can improve our ability to ask questions. And when I've brought this to social settings, for example, there's always one or two people in social settings who are really good schmoozers. They're really good at connecting with other people there. And so one of the things I've done is sort of listen in to the questions that they ask. And any of us can do that, right? Like we can go into a social setting and just, instead of focusing on what we're going to say, focus on listening to how other people interact with others and what questions they ask, and which questions end up really, kind of leading to deep connections. And what I've realized is that it's the questions that people ask where they're really aligned with genuine curiosity. That's where it leads to deep connection, because when asking the question, your facial expressions, your sort of everything is all in, like you're really curious, you want to know something. And for me, I've realized that I like to know about transitions in people's lives. Like if someone moved from one town to another or switched jobs, like who was providing advice to you? What was the advice? How did you decide which advice to take? Like, what was your process? Like, I love sort of getting into things like that. But there's all kinds of questions. I mean, another example is I took my son, I like to take my kids to on individual trips kind of every year from the time they were 5 or 6, and often to conferences, these academic conferences. I took my son to this conference in Canada, and we went to a breakfast, and I didn't know, but he had actually prepared questions to ask, and he had two
That was a
questions.
proud moment for you. You're like, oh, check out a little question guy. This is nice.
Yeah. So, I was kind of planning to talk about, various kind of things around research, but he kind of jumped in, and he had the two questions he asked was, have you ever been in the ER, and what's the story behind it? And then the other question was, what's the kind of craziest adventure trip you've ever taken, like where something went wrong or something happened?
And how
And
old was he?
at the time, I think he was probably like 12 or something.
Okay,
Yeah,
nice.
yeah,
Nice.
yeah.
Those are
And
pretty astute questions for a 12-year-old.
yeah, and I mean those two questions like led to basically the whole meal, like it was like we just chatted, like, so there's so many questions like that, and we can experiment. You talked before about experimentation. Like, we can all experiment with things. We don't just have to live with the questions that come into our mind. We can start to learn about other questions we might ask. We can observe others' questions, and we can try those things out, and see how they go, and try to figure out which ones. Like, all of our lives are living laboratories, right? Like, it's
Mhm.
really exciting when you start to look at life like that.
Mhm.
We have all these senses and how we're experiencing the world. Our brains are just so powerful, and we're only using a tiny fraction of our capabilities. Like the prefrontal cortex in our brain, the front part, is just massive. It's just like, but untapped, for the most part. And then this neuroplasticity we have, our ability to rewire our brains, like our brains are constantly rewiring, but we can actually, through practicing things, practicing rituals, practicing new skills, we can intentionally rewire our brains to be more deliberate and to fill our lives with things that really bring us joy and fulfillment and wellness.
Oh, I love that. I love that. So the book is lit, Life Ignition Tools. And so what would you say are the main life ignition tools of this research that you've come up with?
Well, the book is organized into chapters. Each chapter is a tool, and you don't have to start at the first one. You can jump around. You can look at the table of contents and look at the different titles of the tools, and just jump in at the one that is maybe aligned with something you're going through at that moment. Some of the tools, like one of the tools is called Press Pause. And so it's really this idea that we need time to process information and experiences. We tend to, in this very busy society that's just, we're inundated with data and stimuli and pings coming at us from all different angles. It's like when we take a break, we're actually not really taking breaks these days. Like, we're still activating our minds by doing, emails or social media or Netflix or, whatever it is. And so what I've discovered just on this Press Pause is that and I've done, experimentation. So I used to do back-to-back meetings, but what I realized is that if I actually take 10 or 15 minutes in between meetings, and I go for a walk or just sit there, close my eyes, but not engage in my, with my computer or whatever, my phone, but just really take a break. All of a sudden, I just let my thoughts kind of flow, and things that person I just met with said connect with things that I'm remembering from like a month ago or last week. And then I'm like, wait a moment, like, like I start connecting dots, start to do lateral thinking. I start to sort of come up with ways that I could connect people I met with the week before, the month before, with the person I just met. And then all of a sudden, we're on to something really interesting. But I wouldn't have had that thought had I not taken time to, press pause and let my brain sync up. So that's one tool.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I love that. I want to cut you off right there because I
Sure.
think that there's such a key part to that pressing pause. And I've heard other people talk about this, that like if you're cramming for a test and you're cramming and cramming and you're just spending hours cramming, like your brain's not truly digesting it all. It's in those
No.
pauses that your brain has that time to sort of integrate all those things that you've learned. So if you're like, that's why I like the Pomodoro technique. If you like, let's study for 45 minutes and then 15 minutes of not, maybe just relaxing, that gives your brain that chance to integrate all that stuff that you've just learned. And so that's such a tremendous key right there. That pause is more valuable instead of getting on and playing a video game on your phone, or immediately getting on social media and doom scrolling. Like, take that, quiet your mind, and I think it seems to me from what I've read and what other people have talked about is that's the best time to integrate that information.
You're 100% right. Yeah. In fact, one of the people that I interviewed for the book is a neuroscientist and also a musician, Molly Gerbrian. And what she spoke about is something that pretty much you just said from her research, is that what she found is if you're going to practice a particular skill and you have an hour, it's not good to spend that whole hour practicing. It's better to do like 15 minutes of practice and then a 5-minute pause. And then get back to it. And there's two key reasons why you want to do this. One is because your brain, the actual reorganization of your brain is happening in the pauses. And so that's when you're turning mind into matter. It's in the pauses. And then the second key reason is because when you're practicing something, let's say you're trying to memorize something, for example, and then you take a 5-minute break, you come back to it. You don't remember everything usually. Like you kind of, maybe half of it or a third of it, like only a small part. And that creates what she referred to as the startle effect, which kind of startles your brain. Like, wait a moment, I didn't remember what I just practiced the last 15 minutes. And that then puts your brain into a hyper-focused state where you can then, the next time that you approach the next 15 minutes that you're trying to memorize, it's actually going to imprint more. It's sinking in more. You're going to be able to recall it. And so that's why it's important to take these 5-minute breaks or 10-minute breaks, whatever it is. You can experiment, as a personal thing, but it's important to break it up and not just spend that whole time, studying or practicing. You need those pauses.
Well, let me ask you this, because I know there's some additional research on the other side of things. And so here's the devil's advocate. I think it was the University of California, maybe, that said, hey, it takes 23 to 25 minutes after a distraction to even get back in the flow. Mm-hmm. So how do you balance the two when you say, hey, study for 15 minutes, take a 5-minute break? It's like, wait a second, we're getting all these mixed signals from different sources who've done different studies. And so like, what's the real, how do we know which one's right?
Yeah, I think those studies focus on not pausing and doing nothing, like just sort of to going for a walk or whatever, but actually being distracted with something that continues to activate your brain. And when you do that, you're depleting your cognitive resources further. But when you take a break, you're actually regenerating your cognitive resources. And so that's why you're like creating more fatigue when you're distracted. And I think that's one of the challenges of today's society, is that we just have information coming at us from every possible angle. And it's like, for example, there's $900 billion with a B, spent every year on marketing and advertising to hijack our attention.
Right.
And that's an incredible force. And so that's typically the cause of most of our distractions. And
our attention span is like shorter than a goldfish, as they say now. It's like 6 seconds or something. And so, because we're getting constantly bombarded with these distractions. And so that maybe leads me into the next question around meditation, right? Yeah. And, how do the tools in lit, such as meditation, interact in your perspective with the mind and body? And then I also want to talk about the pineal gland, because it seems to me in my own thinking on this, I had an epiphany one day. I was like, wow, the pineal gland sits in the very middle of the brain, the very middle of the head, at the very top of the spinal column. And so it seems to me that there's something going on with the pineal gland that we don't understand yet. Some people have talked about the piezoelectric crystals that are in the pineal gland. Some people have talked about how most pineal glands has been calcified from fluoride or whatever else. And then I've gone into some other deep meditation stuff when it says, if you're doing group meditation with people and focusing on the same thing, then everybody's pineal gland, those piezoelectric crystals, end up tuning into and creating like this big radio tower signal, because you're all collectively praying or thinking about the same thing. So I think that there's so much around meditation and then just sort of active reflection on things and then intention that most people don't understand or haven't even thought about, I think.
Yeah. Wow. Well, there's certainly a lot there that you
I
just
just wrapped a whole bunch just in there, like, and I volleyed it over to you. And so there you go.
yeah. So, yeah, I'm trying to remember the first thing that you said because I did have a thought on that. My ADHD kind of my brain.
Well, the meditations and how they
Yeah.
interact with the mind and body. Then I went off on my own little parallel about the pineal gland because it's
Oh, actually,
fascinating.
you know what I wanted to say is, even before that, when you mentioned that, our attention span is been decreasing over time, and I think that's it's important just to pause here just for a moment and address that because it's true, and it's directly a function of the digital age and how we're interacting with devices and how content is being served to us, so that it's cultivating that. But I think it's so important for us to not let that be our reality, to sort of acknowledge that doesn't have to be our reality. Like, we actually are at the switches, and we can through practice and rituals and sort of experimentation, we can regain our ability to focus for long periods of time. Like, we don't have to just succumb to what we are being served. And I think that's kind of a big part of LID, is that it's really, it's important for us to realize that we're in the driver's seat, that we have all these possible on-ramps that we can sort of experiment with to regain our attention. I mean, our culture atomizes our attention. It flattens our curiosity. It flattens our creativity, flattens our imagination. But we can get that back. We have these powerful senses, and we can resensitize our aliveness, and there's many ways to do that. So I just wanted to sort of just press pause on that and emphasize
Sure.
that point.
No, it's really important too, because it's almost like, people just get in this state of boredom and they just do what they've always done. I think Dr. Joe Dispenza talks about that, is that we have 30,000, 60,000 thoughts a day, but most of them are the exact same ones we have every day, right? Because we just go into these processes and it's just automatic. Like, oh, I'm not doing anything. I need to check my phone. Oh, I got to check my WhatsApp. Oh, I got to look at my Instagram. Oh, anybody tweeted me yet? And there's this sort of dynamic ego thing behind, like, this sort of dopamine that we're always seeking that next dopamine.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I've done and kind of experimented with, that I find extremely, useful, and it's important to experiment because, LID is not prescriptive. It's not like do this and you'll get better at that. It's more about find what works for you, but definitely experiment and figure it out. And one thing I noticed is, I was driving to pick my son up at school, and I had this urge to put on a podcast or listen to some music, and I sort of reached for the knob. But I was able to intercept that pattern. I was like, wait a moment, like, do I really need that? Like, what happens if I don't turn it on? Right. And then literally like 5-10 seconds later, I had the urge came back and I was reaching again for the knob, and I was able to intercept it. And I was like, and then it happened again, like, 10-20 seconds later, I had the urge. But then after the third time, it didn't come back. I was just comfortable looking out the window and just sort of like letting my thoughts flow. And
like, bad, Dr. Karp, bad. Okay.
And the reason why I'm telling you that is because it's what I experienced, kind of almost like this nuanced experience I had, which was, it was like empowering. It was like this sort of like, it was a little incremental, but it was empowering. This sort of little dose of like, wait a moment, I just stopped myself from just doing what the powers to be want me to do, is just keep getting the content, like flowing to me. And I was able to kind of check the box of like, no, I'm in the driver's seat, and literally in the driver's seat. But, I just was able to intercept it, and that felt good. That really felt good.
You almost got yourself a dopamine hit by not going on
exactly
and getting your dopamine hit. Normally, that's actually a very key learning, folks, around the pressing pause. If you can, because I notice that whenever I do that, I'm like, oh, I'm going to grab my phone because no, don't grab my phone. What do I need my phone for? Oh, I got it. Oh, it's crazy. I don't know how many times when you're just in that sort of brainless state, where I would I noticed this a few years ago, so I don't even use Facebook that much anymore. But it's like I would open up Facebook, I would look at Facebook, and then I would close it. And then just all of a sudden I would be like, open up a browser and be like, Facebook. And I was like, no, what the hell? I just closed this. Like, why am I opening it up again so quickly? Like, what is going on? And you could just see it's almost like a drug. You're like, you get addicted to these social media platforms and consuming content. And so I tell that to my kids. I was like, let's not try to be such consumers of content. Let's be creators, right? Let's use our time to maybe make things that are valuable for others instead of always consuming things that other people have made, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that what we're really getting at here are the algorithms that the major companies are serving us. And whether we know it or not, majority of us are just living those algorithms. But we don't feel like we're living the algorithms, but we actually are when you sort of step back and examine what you do in your life and what products you use every day, and how you sort of go online and consume content. Like we're just we're literally just being, it's almost like we're the chess pieces that someone else is kind of like, go here, and we're like, oh, what's over here,
Right.
and I think that, but it's up to us to recognize that and then take these small little steps, like even just like not reaching for the to turn the knob, like in my example, that was very empowering. And anytime we do that, we intercept, it like lights up our brain, and it creates a domino effect. It opens the opportunity to do it again and again and again, and realize that we are actually the ones that are sort of stewards of our own minds. Like we're the ones who are sort of navigating that and making the choices. But if you don't sort of come to that awareness, then you tend to just be pawns in someone else's game. And getting back to the pineal gland, actually, pineal gland is very important for production of melatonin, which is critical for regulating the circadian rhythm. And so we all have this rhythm, kind of sleep wake cycles, and it's actually it's like what we know of it is really incredible, but we're only at the tip of the iceberg. Like there's a lot of research being done right now to better understand it, and there are certain times of the day that it's better for us to eat, when our metabolism is higher. There's certain times of the day when, even in medicine, people getting like bone marrow transplants, like if you align it with certain times in the circadian rhythm, it actually works better. Like certain drugs work better when you align it with the circadian rhythm. So and sort of, if you even step back from that and you say like, wait a moment, like rhythm, like to me, it's like there's a rhythm of life and a rhythm of all life, right? And it's sort of like, in some ways, we're with this interaction with media and the digital media, the digital world, we're sort of less attuned to the rhythms of life. And when we start to recognize that and reconnect with nature, we start to live the rhythms, and then we get healthier, right?
That's a really great point, because from some of the content that I had been consuming as well recently, and I think maybe even your book was mentioning it around, now I'm making a conscious effort to go to bed at the same time every day, right? And then waking up around the same time every day. And what I'm noticing is I have a sleep number bed, and my sleep number bed is telling me that I'm having greater scores. I'm having a better heart rate variability. I'm having lower amounts of breaths per minute. I'm having a lower heart rate over time, right? And so I'm going through all of this. I'm also taking some vitamin C and some lysine, which I think is clearing, which I've read is clearing out my arteries, which is also allowing blood to flow better, and some of these other things, according to what that said. So, but I'm feeling better. I don't have that lull in the middle of the day as much. And I think that there's something to that. You get up in the morning, go get some sunlight,
Yeah.
kick yourself into gear, and get out into nature. I love that. So many people are stuck indoors most of the day now, doctor, and it's like,
Yeah.
they're not interacting outside at all. And we are nature, and
Yeah.
we're not grounded. we're not, there's just so many things that's going on that's keeping us out. Just as a little side loop, here's my own ADHD is, even our calendar cycle is not matched with nature. Like it should totally be matched up with the moon cycle, but that was superstitious. And so we can't have 13 moons because that 13 is bad. So we need to have 12 months instead of 13, but there's actually 13 moons in the lunar cycle, but our months aren't set up. And that's one of the things I think is we need to get back into the lunar cycle because that's a 28-day cycle. And then we need to fix money. If we can fix money and we can fix the time cycle, then we could get on a better biorhythmic system that's more balanced with the universe instead of this weird system we got going on right now. That's my own personal.
Yeah. I know there's a lot in there. And I think, just about reconnecting with nature. I just think there's so many simple things we can do. Like, for example, open a window in where we're working if it's possible, like just doing that to hear the bird sounds, or, if you're in
maybe get that fresh oxygen in here. Because think about that. We're in this room with windows closed and we're breathing the same air. Open up the windows, let some fresh air in. I love that.
Yeah. One of the things I experimented with just a couple of days ago was I cut my grass in bare feet.
Ah.
So, yeah.
Well, most shoes are rubber soles, so they're not actually. And I have a couple pair of shoes from I don't remember. It's not Vibram, but there was another company similar to that. But they're barefoot soles, but they actually have organic material as the sole. So when you're walking, you're actually getting that negative charge off of the earth. But I love that. How did you experience that by when you were?
I loved it. Yeah, no, I've been experimenting with a bunch of things with nature. One of the things I do is when I'm walking the dogs outside is I cycle through my senses. So I'll say sight, like I'll try and, focus in on one sense. And then I'll look at the texture of the bark on the trees, and I'll look at the clouds, and I'll look at the tops of the trees and the shape of the trunk. And then I'll say hearing, and I'll listen for the bird calls. I'll listen for the rustling of the leaves with the wind, the various sounds around me. And then I'll say touch, and I'll feel the clothes against my skin. I'll feel my heels hit the ground. I'll feel the wind against my face. And to me, that's a way that I'm resensitizing my senses, right? Because when we sit in front of our computers all day, we're really just using our sight, right? And our sight, what I realize is that when I go outside, my sight, I tend to my eyes are going all over the place, or my head is down and I'm just focused and ruminating about something. If I lift my head up, and then that often breaks the rumination, but I see my eyes are going all over. But then if I just focus on a tree, I can regain, like I've been doing this for a while. And now when I look at a tree, I don't just look at it. Like I look at it and I walk by it, I'm still looking at it. Like I'm sort of, like I'm taking it all in. And to me, that's one of the ways I've been able to access gratitude is I start to be grateful for, and curious about, why is the texture like this? Or, there's some plant growing on the tree. Like, how did it get there? Like, was it a spore in the air? Did it grow from the ground? Did some bird drop, like how did this occur? And then I'm sort of looking at I'm sort of noticing things around me that I didn't notice before, like the fractals of life. And there's so many things we can do on a daily basis. Even when I eat my food, what I'll do now is I'll close my eyes for a few bites. And when I do that, it completely changes the experience. And what I also realize when I do that is when I breathe in, I don't really taste things, but when I breathe out, I taste them more deeply. So there's like this cycle of how breathing actually impacts the flavors that, that we all experience. And to me, that's connecting with nature. Another thing I do in full transparency, and I've just been recently experimenting with this, was let's say if I go to the bathroom, right? I like to think about all the biological processes that are happening, right? From when we eat the food to the nutrients going into our bodies, and, all the, nutrients getting into our bloodstream, and how are things moving through the intestine, and all that powerful biology that we all have, all of us. No one can take that away from us. And I like to
At
think
the
about
very end, when you look at it, you go, "Oh, wow, biology."
it.
Yay.
But there's so many ways to connect. I mean,
For
some
sure.
things are not for everybody, but it's sort of like, most things aren't. But like, again, there's so many things that we can do
Yeah. And
to
what I
go
love
on
about
that.
that, what you're just talking about right there, which is completely fascinating, is like having done some of the Aboriginal studies and Native Americans and stuff, and how they were using plant medicine. Like they would use some of those like medicinal mushrooms, and then like because that heightened up all their senses. And you're doing that in an organic, non psychedelic induced way, but they would go out and be like, "Oh, feel the tree," and then it heightened their color senses, so they would typically eat a little bit of mushrooms before they go out and go hunting so they could see better, right? It's wild. But historically, doing those types of things and touch base on all of those senses, and then maybe even at that point, after you go through those five, maybe try even to tap into that sixth sense and see what kind of, maybe then the seventh with telekinesis, and then Dr.
Yeah.
Jeff Karp's going to be sending doing all kinds of stuff. I love it. um, Let me ask about this, because I find this stuff so fascinating, is your bioengineering and how you're looking at nature in a way. Like, for example, you're like, well, how can we create a better needle? And you're like, well, let's look at the porcupine. Let's see how
Yeah.
what needles they have. Or let's look at, oh, we need to, how can we, do this? And then you're like, oh, well, look at the jellyfish. It has these long tentacles that we can make tentacles out of DNA. And like, it's just and then you're like, oh, well, let's look at the slimy creepy crawlies and see what kind of, let's create some different
Mhm.
glue. And so I'd love for you to explain, how your lab looks through the lens of nature to
Yeah.
create better organic products, medical products that actually make sense for us.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, well, one of so just to sort of preface this is that the tools in lit didn't come out of my laboratory. They actually came out of my laboratory for life. And I've been using the tools in the laboratory. And one of the big sort of, big ideas behind lit is that we can intercept the algorithms, we can intercept the routine patterns, we can intercept the habits, and do more deliberate and intentional thinking, and take more intentional action. And so in academia, if we sort of look at academic research, generally the research tends to be incremental. In fact, I think most people, that's almost like the go-to strategy for every job, is to just sort of look at the next step. And what I realize is that in solving medical problems, it's one thing to just publish a paper in an academic journal. It's much harder to solve an actual medical problem and have a product be created from that science. And so we kept encountering all kinds of hurdles and challenges. And what I realized is we needed to change our thinking. Our thinking was, we basically would encounter a challenge or a problem, and we would kind of hit a wall. We'd step back, we'd rethink it, or think that we were rethinking it, but we actually, and then approach the problem again. It wouldn't work because we were applying the same thinking, expecting different outcomes. And so we needed a way to intercept that pattern. And so we've turned to nature for inspiration. So it's this idea that every creature that's on this planet, every plant, has, overcome insurmountable challenges to be here. Anything that can't overcome a challenge or a problem gets extinct. And so ultimately, we are surrounded by solutions, which are ideas for solving problems. And so in my lab, when we hit a wall, we say, like, for example, you mentioned in the intro, a tissue glue that we developed in my lab that can seal holes inside a beating heart. And it didn't work initially. In fact, it didn't work many times over. We were really stuck. So we stepped back at one point and we said, okay, well, what creatures exist in the world, on this planet, in wet, dynamic environments, in environments where maybe water's moving and these creatures remain stuck. And we looked in the sea and on the land, and we found sandcastle worms that they stick to rocks in the ocean, and the waves are hitting them and they remain put. How does that happen? What's the
Mhm.
mechanism? And then we look at snails and slugs. Sometimes you'll see like a snail sitting on a leaf and it's raining, but it's not falling off. Why is it not falling off? And
I
what
was
we
always
realized,
curious about that too, like barnacles. Like, dude, barnacles. How the hell
barnacles.
barnacles stay on the boat like that? That's
Yeah,
crazy.
amazing, right? So what happens is that a lot of these creatures, there's all kinds of different mechanisms, but a lot of these creatures, what they do is they have secretions that are hydrophobic, which means they repel water. And so what they'll do on the surface of the boat or surface of a rock or surface of a leaf, for example, is they'll repel the water away from it and they'll create like a little bit of a chamber where then they secrete a glue, and then that glue can go on a more of a dry surface because they've just repelled the water away. And so that's what we did. We developed a tissue glue that can repel the blood away from the surface of inside a heart. We can actually repel the blood away from the tissue. And then we got this glue to infiltrate into the tissue. And we actually developed a strategy where we activated it with light. We shine light, and then that cured the glue, and it kind of cross-linked inside the tissue as well, because light can go into the tissue to some degree. And we end up with this super strong, almost like a tissue-like Velcro.
Dude, that's so fascinating. Dude, you look at that and you go, man. So do you just like reverse engineer the animal and you be like, oh look, it's doing this and that? It's just mind blowing to me, like how you guys came up with that stuff.
Yeah, it was pretty much that. We found some ideas, like some aspects of the mechanisms in nature, and then we started testing them. We
And
wouldn't
did you take
normally.
some of its DNA and sort of just reconstitute that or something? Because you had like reconstructing something in a biological way is always it seems like a big task.
Yeah, I mean, we operate based on the strategy as well. Like, there's a key mantra in the lab, which I refer to as radical simplicity. So we want to keep things as simple as possible. And
Mm.
so for this, most groups were developing tissue glues that were hydrophilic, which means that they like water, like a Jello, for example. Is it's like like, so there's a lot of materials that are filled with water. So they were making tissue glues that had a high water content. But this was telling us that for this application, we needed to make it repel water, not, and the reason why other groups are doing that is just because most tissues in the body have a high water content. So it was just that simple sort of like, wait a moment, what if we focus on repelling water or blood away from the surface? Maybe that would help. And we wouldn't normally think of that had we not turned to nature for inspiration.
I love it. It's mind blowing to me, but it's like that's why there's genius folks like yourself and those in your lab who are out there helping make the world a little better through these changes and elevating it. So let's maybe go on to beyond the conversation. I got a few other
Sure.
questions here as
Definitely.
we're winding down here, and so you talked about in the book about small changes and doing things like maybe even writing with the wrong hand, just so we can activate the brain's learning ability. Could you maybe talk about that and talk about some other little small changes that can have impact on us positively?
Absolutely. So, when we're born, when we're young, when we were kids, kind of, growing up, there were so many new experiences that we were having all the time. Like, every grade we entered was a completely new experience, a new teacher, and just new material. And first day was always super exciting. And we were doing different sports, first time riding a bike, first time talking. It's like we were constantly doing new things. But what happens is that as we age, we start to live algorithms. So adults tend to live very specific algorithms. You wake up at a specific time, you have breakfast at a specific time, you drive into work, or and then you scroll at certain times, you get your coffee at certain times, you come home, you eat your dessert after dinner, like you watch some TV or whatever. So we live these algorithms, and we're not doing new things all the time. So it's like a big contrast, and that's a product of our culture. And so what we know is that when we do new, which is one of the tools, do new, it literally lights up our brains. Like, our brains glow orange on an MRI when we're engaged in a new activity. And just like, there's all sorts of neurotransmitters like dopamine and oxytocin, and all sorts of them, serotonin, that start to flow in our brains and make us feel really good. And so doing new things brings us fresh energy and also gives us the courage to do even more new things. And so we can break up our day, break up these algorithms in very simple ways. Like, for example, you know, we often might get in our car, drive from point A to point B, and then we get to point B, but we don't even remember the route we took.
Right.
Or right, or we might get to the end of our meal and we can't remember a flavor that we've had. We're completely, we're surprised it's over. There's just so many things like that, and so we can break this with just all kinds of tiny little on ramps. Like, one is just brushing your teeth with the other hand. It's just such a simple thing. And I mean, it could be anything. That's just one example of infinite number. But if you start brushing your teeth with the other hand, what you'll notice is that it's a little bit challenging at first. It takes longer to do it. But if you keep up with it, right? If you practice it, you start to get better at it. You engage your own neuroplasticity, and that's very empowering. That's really, and then you start to get that fresh energy. You start to feel great. And then, you can change the location of your soap or shampoo in the shower. There's so many like little things. You can change the route that you take to work, for example, or walk your dogs, or, just change the path that you go on. And all of a sudden, because our brains, what happens is that our brains love novelty. And our culture is designed, aside from, let's say, engaging in the digital world, that's hijacked, right, to a big extent. But otherwise, these algorithms that we lead, in terms of, if you sort of, if you mapped out what you typically do in a given day, you'll see it's pretty much the same from day to day. And so if we start introducing new things, it can be really simple, like trying a new food or listening to new music. It creates a domino effect in our lives. And we start like feeling that positive energy just start to flow, and it could be like people engage in this, like, who are building a skill, like if a new language or a musical instrument. And these things can be tough, so it depends, like, and it's very personal. So you pick things that you really can experience in incremental ways, that energy. You want to feel it, and sometimes
As
if
you
you're
said in your book, flip the switch a little bit, right?
flip the switch. Yeah,
Flip the
exactly.
switch, baby. All right. I love that, Dr. Karp. That's great. Let me ask this. So we just got a few minutes and you got a call here. And I don't know if we're going to give you enough time in between your calls to be able to process this amazing podcast that we've had here. Let's talk real quick about humility, because this was an interesting thing you were talking about, Native American cultures, and how, and how this sort of impacted them. And so how has humility and the lessons from, Native Americans impact your approach to life and work?
Yeah. Well, I have been doing quite a bit of reading about indigenous ways of being, the kinship worldview. And I think, there's a lot there. I'm still, I'm trying to process what I'm reading.
Oh, you're being too humble. You're being too humble.
Well, I think, there's so many things that kind of jump into my mind, when you say that. But I think that there's just, I just want to make sure that I sort of focus on the thing that is most relevant here. But maybe what I want to say, actually, let me give you just an example from my laboratory of how we embrace humility, right? And it kind of comes from these readings and from these experiences that I've had. So a number of years ago, I started this thing in my lab, which I call the 3-minute presentation competitions. And what that is everybody in the lab presents for 3 minutes on something they're passionate or curious about, right? We tend to advise not to present on your science that you're working on now, something else, like a hobby or something in your life, or just something you want to learn about. And then what happens is people gather, everybody presents for 3 minutes, and then people give critiques of what did they like about the presentation and what could be improved. And people are sort of encouraged to take risks, try things you've never tried before in your presentation. And then at the end, we vote on who gave the best presentation and who gave the best critiques, like to help the presenters. And this is such an incredible thing. I'll just give you a couple examples. Like, someone got up and played a guitar, and there were slides going in the background. They didn't say anything, but they just played a guitar. Someone showed up in a wetsuit and talked about surfing. Someone started breakdancing, and their talk was about breakdancing. Someone made a rap about hamburger restaurants in Boston.
It's got to be some of the most fun you guys have in that lab, because people are coming in and talking about stuff. You don't know what they're going to talk about. It's probably the most entertaining time of your month.
It's incredible. Yeah. And the thing is that it on so many different levels, even beyond humility, it sort of, because you have people who are just step foot in the lab, who are high school students, all the way up to people who are, junior professors, and, it's like doctors and people, everyone's on the same playing field. And so from the humility angle, when people start, getting critiques, right? Like people start saying, here's what I liked, here's what it sort of creates this environment where, it's cultivating it's cultivating humility, because people are now, everybody's on the same playing field. And even though some people have more experience than others, anybody can give critiques, and so and when you start to be able to take, like advice and have suggestions from everyone
And not
around
get
you.
offended or triggered by it, right? He's like, just accept it. Okay. That's
Yeah.
probably hard for some folks that have some big ego, maybe, that have been in the medical space or the science space, because you're mentioning that early on, like, oh, big
Yeah.
ego. But like that humility's got to be a good dose of medicine for them.
Yeah, so that activity cultivates humility, regardless of where you're at. To receive feedback, to give feedback, because at the end of the day, we're all helping each other, right? We're all in this like together. And so when you start to sort of flip that switch, when you start to realize it, we have this ego that's like protect thyself, but this environment, this activity, it kind of breaks that, and it's sort of like creates this thing, because then what you see is when we do it again, a couple months later, you see improvements in how people are presenting, they're taking risks, and you start to realize that all this advice and suggestions are not, to do with like someone's trying to insult you. They're actually everyone's trying to help each other.
Oh, I love that. And that brings me to the next point here, talking about humility. Now let's talk about empathy, because that's one thing that I think is missing so much in today's society is empathy. And you talked in your book about empathy in action, which is compassion. And maybe, talk a little bit about that, as we got about less than 10 minutes here total, but talk about that, because I think that's one of the key messages that humanity itself needs, is how can we be more empathetic and compassionate to our fellow human and our fellow, animals and plants, I guess, our earth.
Yeah. I think one of the ways to access compassion and empathy is through gratitude. And one of the practices that I have been engaging in is actually, I mean, some of them I've sort of mentioned, which I think kind of help with this, but one that I do every meal now is, a friend of mine taught me this last summer, and I've been doing it every meal, which is I put my hands over, he was like, okay, put your hands over your meal and think about the flavor of each ingredient before you eat, right? So we go through and we think about the flavor of each one. And I've gotten better at this the more I've practiced it. Initially I wasn't that good at it. And then he said, we're going to think about the energy from the sun. And we're going to think about the power of photosynthesis and the microbes in the soil and the farmer's hands and everyone who transported this, the ingredients and prepared it. And he said, okay, and now this food will become us. It's going to power all of our thoughts and all of our
That's
actions.
beautiful.
And as I've practiced it, it may not at first seem like this, connects with compassion, but it totally does, because I start to gain more appreciation for the food that I'm eating and where it comes from, and this interconnected mindset of all the things that needed to happen to get that, in front of me. And it starts to open up my mind to like all of the different roles that people had to play, and all of the actions that had to happen for this to get here. And it's sort of it's like a mind shift. I feel like that's what compassion and empathy is. It's sort of like getting out of the me kind of focused state and starting to appreciate and recognize that we exist within this wondrous web of life, which we depend on, but we're also contributing to. And and it's through that I've been able to be more compassionate and really acknowledge that others' experiences are different than mine, but yet we need each other. Like the neurodiversity powers evolution,
Mm.
right? Like if we were all the same, then we likely wouldn't survive that long, right? Because it's all about like
So
trying,
true.
you
Yeah.
know?
And we're in a world now where it's like, oh, if you're different, then if you think different than the way that I think, then I'm going to screech to the sky. And you're like, look, this is what's going to help evolve us even further down the road. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like all opinions are necessary. And we're in this weird censorship industrial complex world now where I don't like what you say, then you shouldn't have a right to say it because I'm offended. And so like, hopefully we can get past that. I want to ask around this right here
Yeah. Yeah.
because AI is so powerful now. And the more I play with AI and just can create amazing images and create, like, are we, and you talked about how we're algorithms earlier, right? So it's like, are we some sort of biosynthetic algorithm living in this advanced biological AI or what? Because the more I play with AI, the more I feel like, dude, I mean, we've only had the Industrial Revolution since the 1760s or whatever. And here we are 270 whatever year, 260 years. Like, we're already here. Like, this is crazy to me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think AI is really just it's just it's like an extension of nature, really. I mean, it comes from us humans. We're part of nature. I think, for example, one of the thoughts I've been having recently is nature got itself to the moon, right? And we tend to think like, oh, we got to the moon, us humans. But my sense is that nature wanted to get to the moon probably before humans even existed,
Mm.
right? And my sense is that AI, nature wants to steady itself. How does nature steady itself? Through humans. So we're like a vessel of nature that has the right level of consciousness to be able to steady nature, right?
Mm.
And to learn and evolve. And it's all, nature has no end goals. It's just about perturbations and adaptations and experimentation and gaining insights. And so to me, like AI is part of that. Like all of us as
Mhm.
individuals contribute to evolution through
Yeah.
our experiences. Like the
Some
more
sort of
deep,
environmental adaptations, right? It's almost like historically, it's like, oh well, I'm here in the ocean, and you just sort of create. Oh, and then you see the little reptile coming up out, the amphibian coming out of the water. Like, evolution is wild, and and life is wild. And I want to thank you for coming on. And one thing I'd like to do at the end of each show is from one of my favorite podcasts, Diary of a CEO. He's got these questions, and so basically a guest we'll write down a question for the next guest, and then they ask it. So I want to read one of these to you and ask you: do you want the one with the gold here, or do you want the silver one? Which one should we pull from?
well, you put the gold one up first, so I'm going to go with that one.
Okay, here we go. The gold one does seem to be read from more regularly. So let's see here. All right, and I want you to tell me when to stop.
All right, stop there.
Stop. All right. Okay. If you could go back to one era in civilization, what era would you pick? Why? And what would your job be? That's from Macklemore.
Wow. Okay. I love it. I would go back. I mean, there's a couple possibilities here, but one of them would be I'd love to go back to the time of when the Library of Alexandria was before it was burned
Oh,
down, and
yeah.
be able to step foot in there and be able to read and accumulate that knowledge, which was completely gone because I think there's a lot in there in that from the wisdom that had been gained through
Mhm.
many generations that
Sure.
I think could help all of us today, but we lost that in terms of how we might practice culture in the most beneficial ways.
Beautiful answer. If we can now take all of that was in the Library of Alexandria and put that into an AI. Ooh,
Yeah,
I'd
yeah.
like to know what's going on. So, all right, final question. What final words of wisdom or encouragement would you like to share with our audience, and where can people best find you?
Well, you can find me on my website, which is just my name, jeffkarp with a K.com. And there you can find all kinds of information about the book, about my laboratory and innovations that are coming out, as well as there's access to some content that's not in the book. And the one thing I would love to leave people with is just kind of going back to some elements of our conversation where thinking about we're really at the switches, how there's all these little tiny things we can do in our day that are completely energizing. And regardless of what we're going through at the moment, there's always a step that we can take. There's this incredible biology that we all have access to, incredible brain power that we have with our prefrontal cortex and accessing neuroplasticity, and nobody can take that away from us. And it's kind of like, if you exercise, you go for a run or a bike ride or a nice walk or whatever, our brain gets flooded with these positive neurotransmitters, but we can access that in so many different ways in our life just by changing up our routines and doing new things, and kind of committing to learning, versus as a way to kind of to step through fear and hesitation, and just say, like, I'll try this, and I just want to learn something. I'm not worried about failing. I mean, there's ways to do that, and I just feel we can fill our days with so many incredible, like, these little nano kind of bursts of energy, and but we just need to just sort of take those steps every day, and that's what I'd like to leave with people.
I love it. Dr. Karp, thank you so much for coming on Spiritual Technologies. And those of you who've stayed tuned and listened to the whole thing, how'd you think about that?